On today's World Insight, as the U.S. doubles down on tariffs that took effect starting August 7, the threats of more tariffs. What are the prospects of an extension after 3 rounds of negotiations?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. U.S. President Donald Trump's sweeping new tariffs on trading partners around the world have come into effect on Friday, August 7th. The new policy means tariffs as high as 50% and even more, and the number varies from country to country. President Trump also threatened Russian oil buyers, China, India, and others with more tariffs. In response, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said last Friday that quote, it is legitimate and lawful for China to engage in economic trade and energy cooperation with other countries, including Russia. So what's the chances of an extension amid ongoing talks? Here's some insights from our panelists. I'm joined in New Delhi, India. Aravind Yellary, Associate Professor from Narahala Nehru University. In Harbin, China, Professor Gong Zhong from the University of International Business and Economics. In Shanghai, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney from East China Normal University. He's originally coming from the United States. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, 2 things we need to discuss today. One is about the tariffs that the U.S. has against the rest of the world, as many as 90 countries. And meanwhile, we are also seeing the so-called deadline of the truce for tariffs between China and the United States. Let's go first to the tariffs set by the United States last week, again against the rest of the world, changed from the earlier plan again. So what does that mean to you, Professor Mahoney?
You know, I think one of the things that I think we have to look at here is that Trump is trying to use tariffs for at least 4 different objectives. And so it's really confusing sometimes to figure out what precisely the strategy is. But one of these is to control U.S. borders. I think this is why he's targeted Mexico and Canada so directly. He's also using it to discipline allies. And we've seen some of his G7 allies being among the first to reach deals with him, this being Japan, Korea, Europe, and so on. But he's also trying to coerce specific foreign policies, like we saw him hitting India over oil related to Russian oil purchases related to the Ukraine conflict, or targeting Brazil over what he saw as the unfair treatment of Bolsonaro. But we're also seeing him trying to punish competitors and competition networks. We see this being probably the logic underlying what he's doing against China, and then at the same time trying to induce U.S. economic restructuring. That's a lot of heavy lifting, and he's having, I think, some modest success in some areas. But I think so far what we see is that few people actually trust the deals they've reached. Few deals have actually been finalized, leading to this allegation that we're seeing phantom deals. And then there's always the concern that he might suddenly change course. And the fact that I've talked to Japanese people who are Japanese diplomats who are relieved that they've worked out a deal, but they resent the deal that they have. And at the same time, I think the bigger deals are still out of reach.
The tariffs the U.S. has against the rest of the world has raised to this level, from the most developed to the least developed. So now the question is, what does this mean for everybody?
What President Trump is doing essentially is to, in my view, to eviscerate and upend entire rules-based international order in commerce with the WTO at its core. So what it means is that WTO is no longer to be relevant to Washington anymore. It's going to be, totally discarded, basically. So basically, I think what we are facing right now is what I described, we've all been saying this, is an N-1 world. It's an N-1 world. In other words, the previous system is missing a major member state here. The United States going away. So I think the question is about whether the rest of the world, China and the European Union, are able to still maintain this international order here, still maintain the WTO. And my view is that it's still very likely that the European Union and China and Japan, South Korea and Turkey, these major trading nations, are still very much interested in maintaining this order in the absence of the United States. So I think we're basically entering into a parallel world right now. One is an N+1 world, and the other is essentially a set of bilateral relations between the United States and the rest of the world. So it's going to be ongoing for some time, and this is a reality we're going to be living with for many, many years to come.
What about in China, Professor Gong? The impact of unpredictable tariffs coming out of the White House, not only just against China, but also against the world. What does that mean to China?
I think it's going to be a reorienting of the global trade structure. What it means with these high tariffs, obviously, America's share out of the total global trade will be lessened. And there will be less trade between the United States and other countries as well, not just with China, but with other countries as well. And in the meantime, China's trade with the rest of the world is actually booming. I mean, you look at the latest July statistics, even against the backdrop of a very significant drop. I remember it's an 11% drop with trade with the United States, but the overall aggregate trade, total trade between China and the rest of the world, the entire world, has been increasing by something like 7%. So I think this is a very clear picture here that world trade is still going to go up, and America's share is going to decline. I mean, it just cannot increase as it used to with such high tariffs.
On the other hand, another factor, what does that mean for domestic consumers in the United States? After all, over the first half of this year, even though we've seen tariffs being imposed by the White House against the rest of the world, it has been changing all the time. And meanwhile, people around the world have been preparing for this moment and therefore trying to come up with different measures to use a time difference in a way and gaps in between in order to lessen their loss of trade with the U.S. But seems that if this rate set by last week to continue some time, we're likely to see more impact on the U.S. consumers, or not? Professor Mahoney?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are already concerns that we're starting to see pressures on the labor market. That's not yet clear. I think it's anticipated that we'll see consumer prices increasing. And at the same time, we've seen a lot of volatility. We've seen a strange combination of volatility and shrugging in the markets themselves. And this seems to be due to three reasons. The first being the so-called taco effect, which means at the last minute Trump either hits pause, employs a complex web of exemptions, or works out a deal. But we've also seen evidence that investors are suffering from headline fatigue and suspecting that these various announcements are negotiating tactics and not hardline positions. Plus, we also have the possibility of high-level meetings this year, maybe Putin and Trump, maybe President Xi and Trump and others, which suggests to some that we may be having breakthrough points already being sequenced. The second thing is, we do see some consumption indices in the U.S. improving, which has buoyed some stocks for the moment and certainly led to some confusion. And some analysis say these are U.S. consumers perhaps deliberately buying now to avoid higher prices later, or the more optimistic assessment that consumers just don't care and they're going to buy or have to buy regardless. But, we do now have an effective tariff rate of just over 20%. And I think there are some questions about whether or not this will ultimately induce the Fed to start making some changes as Trump wants. Will we see U.S. courts rule against him, that he's exceeded his authority? We even saw him over the weekend fear-mongering that if the courts rule against him, we'll see 1929 all over again. But my sense is that I think the sense is that I agree with John that we're looking at sort of a two-world system now, N-1, or however you want to call it. But at the same time, I think the broad assumption is that Trump isn't going to destroy the U.S. economy. And with the stroke of a pen, he can quickly change tactics if he needs to, and certainly ahead of midterm elections. That said, I do think we are on the cusp of maybe seeing breakthroughs with India, China, and Korea, perhaps a trilateral free trade agreement. And certainly there's even talk now of a trilateral agreement between Russia, India, and China.
Mr. Yellery, what do you think might be the impact of the U.S. consumer on the U.S. consumers, given the knowledge of yours, for example, trade between India and the U.S.?
This is certainly going to be pretty dicey for the consumers in the US, because eventually the tariffs, and when they're being imposed new tariffs on the imports, it is certainly going to have a direct impact, not a relative impact, a direct impact on the retail pricing. And that is going to be a little bit of a difficult situation for the US domestic market, because inflation is going to have a percentile level difference. So I think there is a direct relation.
What are the products that your country, India, mainly selling to the United States? And how do you think these tariffs, if implemented, will affect U.S. consumers as a result?
Primarily, there are three components. One is pharmaceuticals, electronics, and textiles, wherein in the present tariff regime, pharmaceuticals and electronics have been exempted very wisely. It's a strategy and tactic. It is not a completely carpet leaving of tariffs. So what remains is the textile, and textile is pretty sensitive market for India because it employs approximately 200 million of people in India. So actually, if US is going to put a tariff on that, that means that the major chunk of this exports which India does to the US will be directly affected. Vice versa, that will also have direct impact on the consumer prices in the US. So that will be quite sensitive for both the markets.
I'll just mention two biggest expenditure items for an average American household. One is automobile, and it's very clear that the automobile prices are going up. Ford Motor Company CEO has just said that they have imposed additional several $1 billion of tariffs already paid to the U.S. government. Guess it's going to digest itself? Of course not. It's going to pass along to American car purchasers. So prices of cars are going up like crazy. I know. Right now there is practically no car price below $25,000. It's a huge burden for American household. The second is housing. That's another big item for American households. America imports a lot Canadian lumber, and with these high tariffs, the lumber prices are going to go up as well. What it means is that in a new house constructed, there will be at least, in my view, $2,000 to $3,000 of additional lumber price.
But I'm also expecting from you, Professor Gong, to tell us a little bit more about how the tariffs against China is going to have an impact on the U.S. consumers. Do you know?
It's going to be across the board. I mean, I think China is a major trading partner with the United States. We have over, I think it's $500 or $600 billion of exports to the United States. So a lot of these items will be affected, from electronics, from Apple computers, iPhones. A lot of iPhones are made in China. The prices are going to go up, and other electronics, and also toys, textile products, labor-intensive products, all these across the board, prices going to go up.
The really complicated question is being formed the relationship between the business community and the current White House or the U.S. government as to how policies will be churned out, and what are the factors regarding these policies while they're being formed.
We saw Tim Cook at the White House. We saw Trump mentioning to Tim Cook that he might impose a tariff of 100% on chips and semiconductors unless they're made in the U.S. But he hinted at a carve-out for companies who build in the U.S. At the same time, we know that Tim Cook probably is very irritated with the increase in tariffs on India, given the fact that he was starting to move production out of China into India. Clearly, that's not going to satisfy Trump. He wants production in the United States.
But also Intel, for example, the direct accusation by the president against a CEO of a private company. Very interesting. Well, that company is going through an interesting time. So, these are there are a long list of direct interactions.
So the issue here is that, as John mentioned, TRIPS are exceptional. They are something that maybe falls more directly under presidential authority, in so much as he can say that that's a national security issue, much more so than maybe some of the other products that are now being contested in court. So that's sort of an opening question. But one of the bigger questions here about presidential authority is whether or not he has the power to essentially slap a 15% tax on U.S. companies if they choose to do business. And so all of it is coming back to what are the limits of his authority? And in the meantime, since we don't really know the answer to that question, people like Tim Cook or other CEOs going to the White House and playing the game of trying to appeal to his desire to be coddled and appreciated.
This complicates the picture of how these companies are doing businesses elsewhere in the world. After all, these are international companies. Their supply chains are all over the world. Of course, they are vowing to also do that in the United States, but this a very close interaction with the White House will certainly have an impact on their approaches elsewhere in the world.
I think what the companies are doing is, first of all, they're trying to accommodate the White House. They're demonstrating that they're going back to the United States, at least showing the tension and announcing these very big plans, a couple of $100 billion, here and there. That's what they've been doing. But they're also facing a lot of difficulties of trying to move this operation back to the United States. So they're talking about the future. Take Apple as an example. They want to move the entire Apple's operation in China back to the United States, the entire innovation and development ecosystem in China back to the United States. I don't think it's going to be very easy. It's going to be more of a long-term project, and I don't think it can be done in a very short period of time. So I think they're playing this game to essentially, in my view, to wait and see, to wait out the rest of the Trump administration's, 3-some years, and see what's going to happen after the Trump administration. I think that's just the game they're playing right now.
I see a long-term impact on the ecosystem. What John was talking about. Essentially, what is going to happen? This is going to have a direct impact on the kind of indigenousness or innovation system which the American companies are trying to do it. There is a cycle of innovations which these companies, high-tech companies, have been involved in past few decades. So if there is a focus by the administration to put more punitive actions against the corporate sector would be dividing their, focus more on, into the litigation part of it, in complying part of it, compliances part of it. So essentially, this is going to make the dream of making America great again into, adversely. So, this has to be seen from a structural institutional aspect also, more than the business aspect. The worst part of the entire process is that the business has been kept on a high priority, but it leads, it comes from the innovation and the edge the American companies have achieved. And the other economies, like you're talking about China, it has played an important role in making that happen. If you're going to take punitive actions on these economies like China and India, that is certainly going to have impact not only on economy or, for example, on consumers, but entire ecosystem globally. And that will be really critical for the present administration.
Deadline of the 90-day truce on tariffs between China and the United States will expire, the coming Tuesday. So this is a big time, even though we have seen 3 rounds of quite coordinated discussions and negotiations on the mechanism of trade and economics between China and the United States. Professor Gong, your input here, what does this so-called deadline mean? After all, it's a deadline that the White House imposed. To you, Professor Mahoney, what does this deadline, apparent artificial deadline set by the United States, likely to be assessed in China?
Well, again, we saw Vance, Vice President Vance, over the weekend saying it wasn't clear whether or not Trump would impose the same penalties on China that he just imposed on India, with it not yet taking effect, related to Russian oil buys. And as you noted, with this meeting between Putin and Trump scheduled, they may come up with a resolution. I don't think they will, but they may find a way to kick the can down the road again. So we may see something. We may see this sort of a delay in the deadline, with the U.S. sort of flirting with imposing the same sort of oil purchase tariffs on China that it's imposed on India, to see how things play out with Russia. And then if that doesn't work out, then we may see him using that and blaming China for supporting Russia and prolonging the conflict there. And that may be one of the ways in which he tries to sell those increases and shifts political blame for those increases that will ultimately come to U.S. consumers to China and the war.
What the three of you have beautifully illustrated is the current White House is trying to use tariffs as a tool, not only for trade itself, but much beyond trade, and use it also as a tool for balancing out some of the problems it is facing, or using it as an excuse to blame others as to why the U.S. has not been able to achieve what its claimed goals are. So what about reactions coming from China, Professor Gong? At this moment, how is China, many of the decision makers, experts in the field, looking at this artificial so-called deadline?
I think China is going to maintain the same strategy. If America slaps on some tariffs, China is going to respond by applying the same amount of tariffs as we have seen back in March and April timeframe. This is exactly what China is going to respond. China is not going to back off because because of political reasons, as well as because of safeguarding our national interest. I think this is the point of time that China can respond to the United States in a way that's very different from the rest of the world, because Washington understands that if tariffs going to be going up on both sides, there's going to be a lot of pain on American consumers, which will be reflected as a political cost to President Trump. During the midterm election by the end of his administration.
Mr. Yellery, how is China's response likely to impact on others' decisions, including in your own country, India?
Since U.S. has been, this administration has been, levying tariffs on India, we have been closely watching the responses by the other countries as well. Don't forget, India was one of the first countries to extend hand or come to the negotiation table, but we were the most frustrated one, because there is no concession coming from the Trump administration, and we have been kept on trying to do this thing, but always the goalposts were shifted by the U.S. So I think that largely we have been seeing how China responds, and then you see that the MOFA spokesperson, in recent of his reactions to the questions put forth by media, says that it supports the strategic autonomy exercised by India, and India has a right to do that. So we have been closely now doing a lot of legwork with all those countries. As Professor Joseph and John earlier said, that minus US, everything is possible, because there is a large disruption which this administration is trying. It is to create own space economically and in the corporate world. It is displacing the engagements of the other countries, which is going to be crucial for India going ahead. Forthcoming SUS summit, what we did in the BRICS summit also, it looks that India is going to play an important role, and none other than the U.S. administration is giving India this role.
Professor Mahoney?
We expected a major breakthrough between China and India relations. I think in May, unfortunately, some people believe that the struggle at that time between Pakistan and India maybe slowed that down. I sense a great degree of optimism among some of the Indian diplomats in China that I speak with, that we may see that move forward with the planned meeting between President Xi and Modi. So, and I've been talking again with Japanese diplomats who think that the trilateral trade agreement has more wind in its sails now because of the struggles. So I do think we are seeing this this movement forward for the alternatives. As we talked before, there'll be the U.S. system and then the rest of the world figuring out how to deal with its own. I think at the same time, though, I would agree with the assessment that China does not want to get sucked into a Trump strategy of cutting a deal with the U.S. that would then undermine its relationship with Russia, India, or any other country that wants to do good business with it. So I think China, in addition to protecting its own domestic interest, will also be protecting those broader foreign policy interests.
On the other hand, China is also aware that certain countries and economic partners might be interested in the U.S.-China antagonism as well and benefit as a result. So all of these are really moving factors for everyone. I guess we'll have to figure it out as time goes by. And final words coming from every one of you as to how do you see the so-called deadline and what kind of directions are we seeing mostly that the world is moving toward, not just the United States, but also the rest of the world. Mr. Yellery.
I think India will hold firm, and this deadline for India, the deadline is August 27. So we're looking at the deadline for China, that is 12th. 15, the meeting is happening between Putin and Trump, but I think Trump wants to put that deadline as one of the hanging sword on our head. But India would never give up on this thing. We will same follow what China, nothing against national interest, holding firm until the deadline passes.
I see. Professor Gong.
Well, in my view, the deadline is in the eyes of President Trump. It depends on modification of a very famous saying, I guess. It depends on its opponent. It depends on its negotiating opponent. If it's a strong country, I don't think these deadlines means much. If it's a country that he can sort of bully and impose his wills upon, deadline's a deadline. Many countries also learning that as well. President Trump issued an ultimatum to Russia, and Moscow responded by saying Russia never deals with ultimatum. And there's not a single word coming from Washington again. So I think really enforces my point that it depends on how you actually, your negotiating partner is going to be alike. If it's a strong country, a deadline doesn't mean much at all.
Professor Mahoney.
I think we may see the deadline extended. If not, if we see that the things returning to more aggression, I don't think it's the sort of thing the U.S. can sustain, and eventually that he'll have to work out a deal with China, one that will ultimately reflect the better interest of both countries, even though we certainly won't see a return to the good old days.
Right. A deadline, if both sides accept, of course, it will be a deadline. If only one side sets, it's never going to be a deadline for everybody else. Thank you so much for the three of you for helping us to understand the latest situation. And things are moving fast as we speak. Mr. Yellery, Mr. Gong, Mr. Mahoney, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.